Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 924 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today, David's on the show. He's using Android APS with some refinements. I'm going to let him tell you all about them. David has a very popular diabetes blog called Bionic Wookie. You can check it out at bionicwookie.com. While you're listening today, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. If you'd like to get 35% off at CozyEarth.com, you can do that with the offer code JUICEBOX at checkout. If you'd like to get a free year's supply of vitamin D, 5 free travel packs with your first order of AG1 from Athletic Greens, you do that at athleticgreens.com/juicebox. And if you'd like to save 10% off your first month of therapy, you do that at betterhelp.com/juicebox. David's terrific. You're going to love him. He's from Australia. Fantastic guy. Wait till you hear what he's doing with this do-it-yourself algorithm. It's really astonishing. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1, a fantastic organization helping people with type 1 diabetes. Check them out on their Facebook page, their Instagram page, and at touchedbytype1.org. I'm going to be speaking at their next big event. I hope to see you there.
I'm David Burren. I live in Melbourne, Australia. I've had type 1 diabetes for 40 years now.
Wow.
I'm in my mid-50s. Mm-hmm. I'll be in my mid-50s later this month. That's what my wife tells me.
Sounds like you're 54.
Yes. Let's see. Quite a few Australians know me because I run a website called the Bionic Wookie.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Star Wars reference in there, which is all about diabetes technology. I've been living with closed-loop systems, self-built closed-loop systems for about more than 5 years now. And I've ended up coordinating a lot of the Australian community of do-it-yourselfers.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, so you were diagnosed, when you were like 14?
Yes.
Okay. 40 years ago was 82. 82. Jesus. Wow, that's a long time ago. Okay. It's crazy. You said you've been doing closed loop, so you've been doing what have you tried a bunch of different versions, or which one did you start with, I guess?
Okay. So I started using a pump in 2010. Mm-hmm. Just to illustrate a little bit about my life, I've done various things during it. My endo had suggested to me a few times that, these insulin pumps might be something that you'd be interested in. You're a fairly technical guy. But I had been very much in the world of, I know how injections work. There's going to be this strange thing of something attached to me. Mm-hmm. What happens if I fall off a boat or I get wet or something? Because in those days, pumps weren't waterproof. And then in late 2009, I attended a local event where I actually got to see and play with some of the Animas pumps, which they were waterproof. Mm-hmm. And I decided, right, this is something I wanted to do. I think that event was in September. Then I organized with my DE to sort out getting a pump, but then I had to put it off until February because over December that year, I was artist in residence on a ship traveling up and down the Norwegian coast, photographing the Northern Lights. Because as well as working in IT, I've also spent quite a few years as a professional nature and wildlife photographer.
Oh, wow.
So I've done a few different things. But so I started pumping. And that went on for probably 6 years before I started using Libre. That was the first CGM I got access to.
Mm-hmm.
That was 2016. And by early 2017, I'd seen the Loop system and I'd seen the Open APS system, and I decided Open APS was the way I wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I was carrying a little Android phone that was being my CGM and feeding the stuff into my little pocket computer that was running the Open APS stuff. I was using an old Medtronic pump. And then in 2018, I got a combo pump, which were being sold in Australia at the time, and that's a pump that has Bluetooth in it, and Android APS could talk directly to it.
That's the AccuCheck?
So, yes, the AccuCheck combo, which has, last year it was discontinued.
Mm-hmm. That had Bluetooth in it in 2018?
That had Bluetooth in it in 2011 when it came out.
Wow. Oh, no kidding. That's cool. That's
it's a very old and primitive pump, and the interface that talks to it is quite slow because basically it's pretending to be a person navigating through the menus. It's not actually sending it direct commands.
Oh, no kidding. Do you see it happen on screen as it
No,
steps down?
No. The screen is blank at that point, and it goes faster than I would, but it's still slower than if you're actually sending commands directly to it.
That's interesting.
But it works.
Yeah. Wow.
And that works quite well. So I've been using Android-based systems since 2018.
Okay. So you use Open APS still today?
I don't use Open APS, but Android APS uses the same algorithm.
Excuse me. I misspoke, but okay, Android APS. Sorry.
Yeah. And I'm not actually using Android APS at the moment. I'm using something that's very similar to it, which is a version of the software that we've frozen for use in some clinical trials. Because I've been involved in running a clinical trial over the last few years of Android APS. So this is on people in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a randomized control trial, so it was all at the level that the medicos would actually pay attention to the results rather than people saying, oh, it works for me, I haven't killed myself.
Yeah, right.
And so that's through a local hospital. And basically, it feels like some of the staff there look at my clinical results of me living my own life doing stuff, and they say, oh, that's amazing results, but we need a clinical trial so we can actually prove this works. And in other words, that I'm not just a freak.
Yeah, right. Well, that it doesn't just work for you and no one else, but it is interesting how you are holding up yourself as an example and saying, hey, look at this. This is what's working for me. And they're like, yeah, that's nice. We need to prove it.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I am proving it.
Yeah. So that trial's over. And on that one, I was the local technical expert on this. This is how it all plugs together. And, we're using a different insulin pump for this. So I was the guy who wrote the Bluetooth driver to talk to the pump. So I'm fairly involved in the technical level as well.
Okay. So let me, just for people listening, I want to just make sure that they understand. So Loop, for example, Arden uses a version of Loop. Actually, I think Arden's using Open APS right now with the Auto Bolus version.
Yep. Is that free APS?
Free
APS-X?
Free APS. Thank you. Well, this is the part this is why you don't come to me, David, on any of this stuff. Arden's using free APS, which is a version of Loop that does auto bolusing. We are waiting to see the version that works with Dash pods, which I think they're getting it close to buttoning it up.
The Loop world is, it seems to be a bit fragmented. So there's various branches and versions that people are experimenting with, which is fair enough. That happens in all systems. But there's Loop, and then some guys made a branched version that they called free APS, which was Loop with some extra auto bolus things. Mm-hmm. And then they made a different version, which is called free APS X with the letter X on the end, and some people refer to it in shorthand as FAX. And that is the Open APS algorithm that's also used by Android APS and Open APS, but running on the iPhone. It's basically using all the communication stuff that was set up by Loop to talk to the pumps and the CGM, but they've put a different algorithm in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So there's at least 3 different systems on iPhones, and to a certain extent, they all look and feel very similar.
Yeah. Is there?
So it's a bit hard to know what people are using when they say, "Oh, I'm using free APS." Which one?
Yeah. Trust me, I don't know that I know. I think sometimes I have people around me that say, "Hey, this is the one you should be using right now." I'm like, okay, fair enough.
Yep.
Do you think there's a lot of outcome difference between Loop, Android APS, Open, all that stuff? Do you think people have basically similar experiences?
I do think there's a difference. The Open APS algorithm, which is called OREF1, just in case I mention that again, that has a bunch of things. It has SMBs, super micro boluses. So that's where it calculates, we need this much basal to do this amount of work because we think we know where the glucose is going, so we need this much insulin. But the basal is going to take a while to get it in there, so the super micro bolus will take a portion of that and deliver some of it as a small bolus now. And then in 5 minutes, it might say, we need some more. Or it might say, I better not put too much in because we've suddenly changed direction. Mm-hmm. Just as well I didn't put it all in at once. So that has made it reasonably fast at reacting to things. Its carbohydrate model, unlike the commercial Loop systems, it's a dynamic one where you tell it how many carbs, just like Loop, you tell it how many carbs, and then it decays those away. It has an idea of how many carbs are on board, and that's partly affected by what your glucose has been doing. So it basically only decays them away when it says, it looks like that was one of the carb effects going on because that wasn't the same as what we predicted was going to happen without the carbs. Mm-hmm. But then it has a mode it calls UAM, which is unannounced meals, where it looks at what your glucose is doing and says, that looks like food. I'm going to treat it like it was food. I have not counted carbs or declared food to my system for almost 2 years now.
I asked ChatGPT to write an ad for Touched by Type 1, and here's what it came up with. This episode is brought to you by Touched by Type 1, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting and empowering individuals living with type 1 diabetes. Living with type 1 diabetes is a daily challenge, but Touched by Type 1 is here to make that journey a little bit easier. With their incredible range of resources, educational programs, and community events, they're committed to making a positive impact on the lives of those affected by type 1 diabetes. From the Dancing for Diabetes event to their annual conference, which, by the way, I'll be speaking at, doesn't mention me, but I'm not insulted by that. Touched by Type 1 is always striving to make a difference. And the best part, Touched by Type 1 is offering our listeners an exclusive opportunity to join their community and assess their resources for free. That's actually all true. touchedbytype1.org. Just visit their website or find them on Facebook or Instagram. touchedbytype1.org. Love this thing. I'm not even going to have to think anymore. Don't let type 1 diabetes define you. With Touched by Type 1 by your side, you can lead a fulfilling life and take control of your health. So head over to touchedbytype1.org and get in there. Learn more about it. I'm adding that part because it's pretty great. They have a wonderful website. They do a lot of amazing things for people with type 1. There's a bunch of programs. Just seriously, take a couple of minutes to look into them. And if you're coming out to their event this year, I hope we meet. Please say hello. touchedbytype1.org.
I have not counted carbs or declared food to my system for almost 2 years now. I do not carb count. I do not bolus. I just eat and live my life. I don't know anyone who manages to do that on Loop unless they're a low carber. Mm-hmm. I would probably eat 200 to 300 grams of carbs most days, and sometimes I go way over that.
Hmm.
So I would not describe myself as a low carber.
So, so the UAM, unannounced, what does it stand for?
Unannounced meals.
Unannounced meals. So, and this is on the Android APS that you're using.
That has it, yes.
Okay. And it sees, so you just eat, and it sees the rise, assumes it's a meal, and hits it?
Essentially, it's doing it in that cautious way of, we're not going to bolus everything. We don't think this is a 100-gram meal, so we're going to give it however many units of insulin right now. Mm-hmm. It does it piecemeal, but because it can come along every 5 minutes and dose another little bit more, it reacts fairly well. Now, I knew that the system had this, that the algorithm had this functionality in it back in 2017 when I started. And this was one of the things that probably affected my decision as to which system I was going to go for. I didn't know anyone who went completely bolusless at that point. Mm-hmm. But it's always doing that in the background and saying, oh, you missed a snack, I'm going to bolus something for it. And back in those days, I was using Humalog. That was the fastest insulin we had access to here. Mm-hmm. When I got access to FIASP, I thought, oh, this is great. I'm finally going to be able to try and go hands-free. And we were going out for Mexican that night, and that was a disaster. So
didn't work out the way you hoped.
No. It took a fair bit of fine-tuning. First of all, I had to get the dosing adjustments changed for FIASP because the system was reacting slightly differently. But then I know a lot of people who see what I'm doing and they come along and say, quite understandably, I want that. Right. What do I do to plug these things and turn it on? Because I want that now. And my general feeling is, well, it takes a while because you need to know that you've got your underlying settings right. Because what I started with was, yes, I was counting everything, declaring everything. I was counting and declaring protein as well, because protein I can declare as though they were a smaller amount of carbs in the future. It sort of matches what the body does.
Right.
I was counting and bolusing for food. And then I was getting great time in range. Everything was going where I wanted. And then I'd start skipping announcing on some snacks. And it worked. I stayed in range. And then you do it on a bigger snack or a meal, and it all goes out the window. And I haven't quite got it right. Go back and fine tune. Then I went through a phase where I counted and declared the carbs, but I didn't bolus. Well, actually, a step before that, I counted and declared all the carbs, but I bolused less than the full amount, with the expectation the system was going to take care of the rest. Mm-hmm. Because essentially, in my mind, when you bolus for something with these systems, the bolus is really just giving it a head start. The algorithm should work out what's going on, and if you've told it what carbs are in there, that's going to do great. Mm. If it has to guess it all by itself, it might not go quite as well. I actually found if I undercounted the carbs, it's almost as though the system says, but you told me it was this much, and it doesn't react fast enough. If I overcount the carbs a bit, it says, oh, you've told me it's this much, but I haven't seen all of those yet. And eventually, they must have not been there. Because the algorithms always had this thing where it dynamically decays the carbs so that if you didn't eat the second course or you dropped your ice cream and didn't actually eat it, then it wouldn't necessarily try and deal with all of that food that you might not have actually eaten. Mm-hmm. So it's fairly flexible in that way, but it was a general process of taking away the bolusing, but still declaring the carbs, declaring all the protein, and yes, everything was coming in right. Oh no, I have to tune things. My insulin to carb ratio needs a bit of tweaking, or my profile needs a bit of tweaking. And then I think it was November I made some notes in my diary. November was the last time I bolused, And then in February was the last time that I declared carbs, because I'd gone through Christmas with not bolusing, declaring all the food, but not bolusing. And this was Christmas, New Year. There was lots of food on the table and everything sort of went in range. And that gave me the confidence to say, right, let's go completely hands-free and see if it works. Mm-hmm. And it did.
Let me ask you a little bit about the food you're eating. So, I mean, is this like a very balanced meal of natural foods and etc., or is this Captain Crunch? You know what I mean? Like, are you not taking in a lot of high fructose corn syrup? Are you avoiding things like that?
I do have celiac disease, so I'm avoiding things with gluten in them, mm-hmm. which means that I tend not to eat so much bread. So maybe my diet isn't completely typical. I do find I try to eat sensibly, but I don't all the time. We try to have meat and veggies and a mixture of things. Mm-hmm. Breakfast is the meal that I probably pay most attention to, because I always found that I was most sensitive to carbs after fasting.
Yes.
And that might be because the gut is all primed and ready to accept these carbs and leap on them. That might be one way of looking at them. I have some friends who have children with diabetes, and they swear by, we give the kids something to line their stomachs that's like bacon and eggs or something, and then they can have cereal and it doesn't spike them through the roof. So my breakfast, I have a standard breakfast, so basically yogurt and some strawberries and some psyllium husks, so there's fiber in there. It's just a simple, basic breakfast that I don't have to think about. I can just get up and go to the kitchen and have breakfast and get on with my day. I'm on autopilot at that point. Mm-hmm. And it's not a huge amount of carbs. And once my body's reacted to that, and I chose that breakfast when I was still counting and bolusing, because it was just easy to organize. I didn't have to think about what's my carb count this morning. I could just say, I think it's about 17 grams for breakfast. It's not a high carb breakfast. But after that, whatever food I feel like eating, whether it's 180 gram block of chocolate or an apple, or sometimes I'll have like I said, I tend not to eat bread. So sometimes I have things in wraps, but they're sweet potato wraps because there's no gluten in those. Mm-hmm. Most of I tried to go low carb in 2017. I thought this will help me control my my glycemia, which was bouncing around all over the place. But in fact, it didn't especially help. I was actually thinking at the time I need to lose weight because I was classified as obese at that point. And I didn't really lose weight. But later on I worked out, no, it's actually about the calories when you're trying to lose the weight.
Yeah.
Just eat a reasonable number of carbs. But I've never really, actually, when I say never, years ago when I started out, it was you inject this much and then you eat this much. We ate to the insulin. Sure. Whereas now it's, if I eat more, I'm going to inject more, or more to the point, if I eat more, my pump will have delivered more insulin by the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say staying in range, what do you mean by that? What are your goals?
Okay. So I'm hesitating a little bit because my brain tends to run in millimoles, and I know you're used to milligrams. So in milligrams, the range I aim for myself, like the green band on my setup, is 70 to 140.
Okay.
And my target is around 90. That's where the system's aiming most of the time.
How often do you get under 60, a low that you need to do something about?
Let's see. Now my brain is saying, what's 60?
I can get up my my chart so I can talk to you like this. Hold on a second.
3.3. Bloody hell. Sorry, I shouldn't swear. The What I should do, because one of my friends calls me Sir Graph a lot. Let me pull up a spreadsheet. My time in range for 70 to 140 is generally averages around 85%.
Oh, wow.
And if I just find this document, here we go. My time below range for I've got all sorts of pretty graphs here. Here we go. Time below range for 3.3. That would be around 0.5% of the day on average.
So you don't, generally speaking, find yourself rescuing your blood sugar with fast-acting glucose very often?
Every now and then. I've had some weird things just in the last couple of days where I'll be low in the middle of the night, and this is not the way the world works, but it's a timing thing with the way I've changed a few settings recently, and it's to do with the high insulin on board that I've had the previous night. Mm-hmm. So I'm tuning that. So I've generally got rescue carbs around, and I always have rescue carbs with me if I'm off on a big bike ride. Exercise makes things tricky, but I generally don't go through them very often.
When you talked about earlier that you had to change your settings to work in this system that you use, where you're telling the algorithm, look, I'm eating, but don't give me all this insulin or don't give me any of it, and then it's on you to use it as you see fit. Are you still doing what's my question here? Did you change your settings to make them so heavy that they wouldn't work manually if you went back to just, do you know what I'm saying?
No. So the basal that's programmed in is my default basal. If my loop turns off, I know that it will keep me fairly flat.
Okay.
As long as I'm not changing things with food and so on. Mm-hmm. So no, all of those numbers are traditional numbers, but I'm really confident in them. And some of the other things that I tweaked were tuning the insulin modeling. So, for example, the duration of the insulin in the system and the way it decays, so that hours after a big meal, the estimate of insulin on board is actually correct. And I found that made a big difference to how the system was automatically reacting. Mm-hmm. I can make its predictions actually match reality.
Was that easier when you moved to Fiasp?
I actually found it, yes, I found it easier to tune and notice the differences when I went to faster insulin. So I've used Nova Rapid and Apidra and Humalog and Fiasp and Liumjev. We can't get Liumjev in Australia. I mean, it's not approved as a medicine here, but we're allowed to import it for personal use. So I got some from a friend in Europe and have done some experiments, and it's quite nice. The faster insulins, the decay in the insulin happens faster, so it makes a lot of these things more visible.
Right. So the algorithm, it's more precise. So that
yes,
so decisions.
I found it easier to make that tuning, but at the same time, having tuned the system, it felt like the faster insulin let me move into this mode where the system could take care of most things for me. Mm-hmm. But I have since experimented and gone back to the slower insulins like Humalog and Nova Rapid, and life stays the same.
Interesting.
It's all automatic. I do go high after a meal, and it takes longer to come down. And looking back in the old days, I probably would have said, "Oh, I'm too high. I need to bolus. I need to correct and get things down." Whereas now, I have confidence in what the system's doing, and I know in a couple of hours it'll have me down at the right point. I'll be flat in the morning. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
So the faster insulins are they give me more freedom, but I know the slower insulins work. There is a complication in trying to compare them, though, because I compared my time in range for a couple of weeks on one versus a couple of weeks on the other, and they were about the same. I was thinking, hang on, this can't be right. The faster insulin is supposed to be better. And then I realized I wasn't eating the same because I had the faster insulin. It's, I'll just eat that and it'll take care of it. So I wasn't keeping everything else the same.
That's interesting. I tried my hardest to switch Arden over to one, and she just had the fiasp. She describes sometimes as burning, but the biggest problem is that when her pump site came off, it felt bruised for a while after that. The Lumjev was significantly worse than the fiasp for her, which is a shame because I also talked to a lot of people who don't have any trouble with it. But
I was aware of these going in because a whole bunch of people in Europe have been using it for a while and have discovered things about them. So, whoops, my background's just gone.
That's funny.
With fiasp is Nova Rapid with the addition of niacinamide as the main accelerant. And yes, a lot of people report stinging. Some people report occlusions. Sometimes they say the occlusions in the pump. Some of them report that their site gets red and inflamed and they have to change the cannula more often. Some people report that after some random time, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, it's like it turns into water and it doesn't work anymore and they have to change back to something else. So I was aware of all these things before I started. So what I did was I mixed fiasp with non-accelerated insulin. So if you think about Nova Rapid and fiasp are the same thing, but fiasp has some of this accelerant in it. If you mix them together, it's still the same insulin, but there's less accelerant. It spreads around. So no doctor is going to say you can do this, but it's all completely off-label. But I used that sort of setup for about 3 months, and I didn't have any stinging. And then eventually I changed to 100%, and I didn't have any stinging, and I haven't had any stinging. When it came to Lumjev, similarly, Lumjev is the same insulin as Humalog, but with the addition of a little vasodilator, trepistanol. I think I've remembered that name right. Anyway, it's also used in some other therapies as a vasodilator, and the general reports there seem to be it stings like hell, but you get used to it after 6 months and your body adjusts and it goes away. So what I did with Lumjev was I mixed it with Humalog, so I had a lower concentration, and I did that for a few months before I went 100%, and I haven't had any stinging. I did notice some stinging early on, but it didn't last long.
Yeah.
One of the other things relating to that is Lumjev is available in U200 as well as U100. And a lot of people report that the U200 doesn't sting as much.
Interesting.
And that makes sense because the accelerant in that is the same concentration for U100 and U200 by volume. So when you administer 1 unit of the U200, you're getting half the amount of accelerant than you would with the U100. So it's the same sort of thing of less accelerant.
Right. Less stinging. Yeah, Arden described the Lumjev as unbearable. Like she lived with the fiasp for weeks and weeks and weeks before she finally just said this isn't getting any better. But the Lumjev, she was like, you have to take this off of me. I don't think she made it maybe more than an hour or so, which I found I
Yeah,
found, exceptional.
I don't know if my success with them has been because I took it very slowly and introduced it slowly, or just whether I was never going to have a problem anyway.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know,
There's
but
no way to know. So this process you use, do other people use it as well, or is it just work for you? I mean, you're describing basically not counting carbs and not pre-bolusing at all, and you're doing it just with settings. I mean, that sounds great. That sounds a little crazy. So I'm trying to decide if you've given it to other people or
not. I started doing this because other people were doing it with some of the faster insulins in Europe. And I've been doing it for a while, and I've been fairly vocal in our local community about the fact that I'm operating this way, because someone says, I had to carb count for this, I had to bolus. I'm a bit mean sometimes. I say, a bolus? What's a bolus? But some people have told me since that they've been emboldened by what I'm doing, and they occasionally don't bolus for some foods, and everything works. And some people don't bolus anymore, but they do announce most of their foods, or they announce the big meals. Sort of there's these compromise lines. Because one of the nice things about this is you don't necessarily have to switch everything and go completely hands-free. You can do any of those stages along the way. And it's been surprising for me how many people just pipe up every now and then and say, oh, yeah, it's working for me too. And it's, oh, okay.
Right. Well, we can, I guess you can kind of post-date a bolus in Loop. So if Arden's taking in something that I think is has a lot of fat in it, or it's been deep fried or something like that, those sorts of foods, if she makes a bolus and pre-boluses her meal and then tells the Loop, I don't know, an hour from now, expect 20 more, the impact of 20 more carbs, for example. I find that gives the Loop the autonomy to push harder when it sees a rise than it would if you didn't put these, this impact in the future. That works really well, honestly.
Yep. I used setups like that early on to try and understand what was going on, and that works quite well. A couple of things to talk about there. So, there is a strong sense of, yes, this stuff works for me, but maybe it's just that I'm a freak. I don't mind being called a freak as long as it's got you're doing it with a smile on your face. I know quite a few other people. I've said it's surprising that this is working for quite a few people, but there's also quite a few people who say, well, no, it doesn't work for me. I've tried that and it doesn't work. Now, I don't know if their bodies are different. Maybe their bodies are the same and they're just not holding their mouths the right way, but I think that's less likely than we are all different, because that's the nature of diabetes. We're all different. I know quite a few people in Europe are saying the totally hands-free stuff works, but you have to be using Liumjev for it to work, and you need all of these settings. And some of them use fairly aggressive setups where they enable some of the automation in Android APS. So, for example, when you're going high, it changes the rates and says we need a stronger profile to try and fight it to bring it down. And essentially they start implementing another level of loop algorithm on top of what the system's trying to do. And that sort of works for them. And I tried doing some of those things early on, but I found it often overreacted. And for me, I found it was better to get the base algorithm doing the right thing. Now, there's a bunch of people who've made variants of Android APS. There's a dynamic ISF, Boost, Amy, there's a Tsunami. There's a bunch of different variants where people have been changing the algorithm to make it more aggressive. So it says, oh, it looks like we're getting food. We're going to change the rates and dose more for the next half hour, or do whatever changes. And if you've been using a lot of insulin lately, we're going to assume that you're more insulin sensitive. And dynamically change things. So people have been doing all sorts of experiments. And a lot of people are quite enthusiastic about those systems. They're not mainstream yet. They're still experimental versions on the site. I'm probably the unusual thing about me is I'm managing to do this with the standard stuff that's been around for a while and not using those advanced algorithms.
Yeah. Well,
now I did mention the last clinical trial I was involved in, which is over, which was using Android APS and showing that, yes, it's safe and effective and we get good clinical results. We're lining up to do the next one. And I mentioned before, the researchers tend to look at what I'm doing and say, we need to work out how to do that. You can guess what the next trial's about.
They're going to try to figure out why you're not having to pre-bolus your meals.
Yeah, so we're going to have a whole bunch of people in 2 countries who will be doing that in a randomized control trial.
Wow. How long does that take to do that study?
It's going to take about 2 years to run, I think.
Wow. How many people do you think will be involved in it?
It's less than 100, and they're not all running at once. That's why it gets spread out a little bit, but people will be involved in the trial for over 6 months each.
Wow. That's pretty great. When these hospitals get this information, what do they do with it? Right? Because it's not like Android APS is a company. You don't go back to them and say, "Here's what we're learning." There's not like a dedicated group of 500,000 people sitting in a circle waiting for you to come back with it and tell them what to do. Like, what happens when you get the data? Is it just inform more research, or you know what I mean? What's the goal of it, I guess?
Well, I called it a hospital. The sort of hospital I'm working with is actually not a hospital. It's a medical research institute.
Okay.
That happens to have patients and run endocrinology practice and do all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And most of the participants in trials, they do lots of trials. Most of the participants in trials come from their client base.
I see. Okay. So they have other things they're trying to move forward as well.
Yeah. And certainly the results of this stuff gets fed back to the community, mm-hmm. because this stuff is used in multiple by multiple software systems. It's used on some of the iPhone systems, like free APS X, for example, the same algorithm.
Right.
And there's a general feeling of everyone should be able to benefit from this, because the algorithm that's being used is not some secret source, not something that Type 0 have made up in a lab or Cam Diab have made up in a lab and are not telling people exactly how it works, because that's their secret source. This is all open source. Everyone can see what it's happening. So hopefully new products will come out and be able to take advantage of this, because this stuff is really making life easier and better for me and for lots of other people, and it needs to be able to do that for a lot more.
Yeah.
Well, everyone deserves one of these systems.
Yeah, that's the real goal, isn't it? And what I was thinking earlier while you were talking is, even though the retail systems are all relatively new in the last couple of years, it's still kind of astonishing that they can mass market put it on people and get results like that. Because I mean, like what you're talking about is, I have a system, but now I significantly understand the implementation of how it works. I significantly understand my settings, like really specific stuff that you put a lot of time and effort and attention to, while other people are just like, look, I'm buying this thing, it's on, I want it to go. And they're having reasonable like results for the most part. And that's astonishing to me. Like, I don't know how you make something that needs this level of detail, and yet, you know what I mean? Like, you don't ask the people what they eat. You don't ask them if they're hydrated. You don't ask them if they exercise, if they don't exercise, and people are, I don't know. Well, it's amazing,
I do still tell my system when I'm exercising. I tell it to change targets because I'm managing the insulin on board. Mm-hmm. And I think most of the commercial systems have that, whether it's Cam APS has, you're going to ease off or a boost. It's basically got a brake and an accelerator function, and Control IQ has exercise mode and
Yeah,
so on.
all I meant is that you can't know that when you hand something out to the masses,
Oh yeah,
they're not all doing it
and
the way you are. You know what I mean?
this is the big compromise that we're all dealing with, and this is why the commercial systems. I guess it's one of the reasons why the commercial systems don't have all of the functionality that, for example, I have access to,
Sure.
because they've had to go through the regulators, because the regulators say this needs to be safe and not kill people.
Yeah, and for everybody, not just people
Yeah.
who will take a ton of time
Now,
to understand it, but you know,
now, unfortunately, some of those regulatory decisions, I, I think sometimes because they don't. It may be because they don't always include people with diabetes in that decision-making process. I think they sometimes end up with less safe things, such as the examples of the Medtronic system. So they had the first commercial closed loop. And it's basically, oh, we've been working too hard. I've been giving you so much extra insulin and you're not coming down. So I now need to stop and drop into manual mode and stop helping you because it's obviously not working. That was some bean counter said, well, that's the safe thing to do.
mm-hmm.
Whereas if I'm sick in bed with the flu, I want the damn thing to keep delivering insulin and to help me get through this problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and no, it's 100%. I mean, all of them are, I'm assuming, at some point drawing a line in the sand and saying this is as far as we'll say we can help. And you know, if something happens past that, it's got to go back on the user, right?
But I think some of those fall back on the user have been a little bit primitive in terms of, well, that's the way it used to work when you had a manual system.
Mm-hmm.
We just say, oh, the user take care of it again. But the user at that point has got used to it doing a lot of work for them. So it's suddenly a bigger dropout for them and it becomes less safe. So finding the compromise on all of this is a challenge for everyone.
Arden's at college now. And just last night, she had a meal while she was, she's in her room working. And I think I'm watching it like get away from her. And I sent her a text and I don't think she saw the first one. And then she gets this rise that just goes 140, 150, 160. And I'm like, Arden, you didn't put in a secondary bolus if the meal was, and now I'm at a bit of a loss. I don't know what she ate, So I'm like, if the meal was heavy in this or this, you forgot your secondary bolus. She's like, well, it wasn't. So I'm just going to make a correction here. And I'm like, okay, but I didn't see it working. And now she's fighting with it for a few hours in the late evening. And she loses the fight with the bolus and she loses the fight with being tired and she just goes to sleep. And, I tried to wake her up. It's a higher blood sugar, not a lower one. So I'm like, all right, well, I sent her a text. I'm like, hey, you got a bolus again? I don't hear from her. I finally called and woke her up and I said, hey, put some insulin in here. But at that point, David, I don't know what to tell her. I don't know what she ate. I can see what the algorithm's been trying its hardest over the last couple of hours. It's not working. It's just keeping her level at a higher number. I know she needs more insulin, but I don't know how much. And I'm tired. And you and I we're going to do this. I'm going to be up early in the morning. My son and I are doing something later tonight. Like I've been sick recently. I'm like, I got to sleep a little bit here. And so we put in enough insulin. We weren't as aggressive with it as I would have been if we were wide awake and looking at the same example. But she woke up this morning at like 110. And I mean, on any manual system, or if a system would have kicked into manual, she would have been, I'm assuming she would have been 200 plus, and she would not have woken up with any kind of resolution to the blood sugar. This doesn't happen to her all the time, but it's your point about, I know this thing's going to do what it's going to do and I'm going to end up okay. It's an amazing benefit, Yeah. So anyway, what else did you want to talk about? What made you think I want to come on and talk about this on a podcast?
I think it was probably something I posted in the Facebook group that you responded to and thought he sounds like an interesting person to talk to.
I definitely did that.
Could be.
But I have to admit, David, 45 minutes into this, I don't especially understand why you don't have to bolus for food. I don't know that
Okay.
I don't know that I understand why it's working for you, or like if somebody's listening to this right now and they're like, well, I don't want a bolus for food. Like, this sounds great. Like, what do I do?
Yeah. I don't have easy answers, but I've got some things that might help understanding a little bit, because I've talked to a lot of people who say, how can this work? There's, for a start, the CGM is always lagging behind. And then when we inject the insulin, it's going to take a while to happen. So when the system sees that I'm going up, how can it react in time? It's hard enough for me to bolus and pre-bolus enough for something to act in time. But I think part of it is the way the dosing works, because it does all these predictions. The ORF1 algorithm, when you're using Loop, you see the predictions of where we're going to go. And that, or I should say, the prediction, singular prediction. It's a line that goes off somewhere, and it might go down below zero at some point, then come back up 3 hours later and go sky high, which doesn't make any sense, because if the line went that way, you'd be dead by then. The ORF1 algorithm draws, it's called an ensemble forecast, multiple lines. One of them says, this is where we'll go if you didn't eat any of the food you just told us about. This is where you'll go if you did eat the food. This is where you go. This is where you'd go if we turned off the insulin now. It makes a bunch of predictions. And there's another line of, this is where we'll go with UAM. So where we think you're going based on what we've noticed about the food, that's where the line goes. See, there's these massive lines that go out to the right on the graph. And a lot of people look at that, they're different colors. They look at it and say, well, how do I know which one is right? Well, the system doesn't know which one is right, because those are all different possibilities. But it plays a safe game, so that if any of those are going down into hypo territory, it's going to make the decisions to try and keep you out of there. It makes a guess as to which one of those is your likely ending point, but that guess may change in 5 minutes' time. Every 5 minutes is drawing new predictions and saying, right, looks like we're going over there. Looks like we need this much insulin to try and get us back to target. And then if it calculates that we need, it looks like we need 3 units of insulin, then it might deliver one of those or 1.5 of those. And then 5 minutes later, it could say, no, we need 10 units of insulin. So it starts putting some more in. So it actually does that at a much finer level. So if I was looking at my CGM and saying, it's trundling along, it's going up and down, it's going up and down, that's about level. Or is that going up? The next reading comes in. Is that going up? Yeah, I think that's going up a little bit. I'm going to have to bolus. The automated system by that point will have been doing a bunch of little micro boluses along the way, saying, looks like we might be going up, we'll need a little bit.
Right.
Looks like we're going up a little bit more, we'll need a little bit more. The point is, those little bits of insulin are already in your system and working. So when we're looking at things manually and saying, all right, I need to dose now, we've introduced a big delay, and the insulin is going to have to play catch up. So I think that regular dosing actually helps the system stay on top, because it's taken a few choices, trying to stay safe along the way, and added some insulin into the system already.
It's almost like it works better when it has insulin working and it can adjust by taking away instead of
we can never we can never take the insulin out.
Not taking away what's in there, but taking away basal in the future. Do you know what I mean? Like, instead of you using a unit of basal over an hour, it sometimes it feels like if you just gave it the unit and then let it decide, okay, well, I'll turn the basal off, and I'll put it back on to 0.2, and I'll bring, like, you give it a lot of autonomy that way. And I have noticed that it works well when it has the insulin at its disposal, and then kind of works backwards from that. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
it sort of does.
Yeah.
In a non-looping environment. We all start off from the assumption that the basal is just constant. Whereas now we know we can turn that off, or turn it back on in the future. So historically, endos often talk about your basal bolus ratio. Oh, 50-50% is a nice balance. And crazy talk as far as I'm concerned. For a start, if you're having a high carb day, you're going to have a lot more bolus, but your basal is not necessarily going to be more.
Mm-hmm.
But then it doesn't really matter if it's basal or bolus. It's just insulin that goes in. It doesn't matter if it gets given as a bunch of separate boluses or as increased basal. It's just insulin. As long as the system is tracking when it goes in, we're getting the right amount at the right time. That mix of which one it is doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Which makes it a little bit hard when you have an endo who says, but the percentage.
Well, I know something about the setup of Omnipod 5, they want it near 50-50, but then the algorithm almost immediately makes decisions after that and moves things around. So I don't think, it's something about the way that one's set up. It's important, but when you go back and look at the insulin, it's not always going to be like that. Yeah, I don't see why I don't understand why 50-50 is important. That sounds arbitrary to me.
I think it's a historical artifact. When people were dealing with basal and bolus injections, that was sort of a guideline as to this sort of works for most people. It's a good starting point. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's the goal that you need to try and get back to.
Right. No, you need the basal you need, and you need the bolus you need. That's it. It's just
in today's world with the pumps adjusting things up and down, you just need the right amount of insulin at the right time, and the basal and bolus is all the same stuff.
Right.
So whether you take away what we were going to give it by default by basal in the future, which is what you were talking about, amounts to the same thing.
Well, I think too, I want to mention that the idea of I don't understand why do I notice things working very immediately on a looping system when we know the data's behind from the CGM, when the insulin takes time to work. I don't know how to describe why that is, but I do know it's true. I do think it's just, I think the algorithm by guessing at the future or predicting so many different possibilities in the future, I think it's somehow shortening the distance between what's actually happening in this moment and what the data can tell us is happening. Because you can, and tell me if you've seen this too, you can look at a blood sugar that's not moving, right? And the algorithm's trying. It's given with Loop, what is it giving you? I think 40% of what it's suggesting. So it suggests a unit, it gives you 0.4. It waits 5 minutes. There's still 0.6 less that it hasn't given you. It gives you another 40% of that. And it's making those boluses along the way. And you look and you go, this is not enough. It's clearly not enough. If you manually in that moment push up the basal insulin, or you manually in that moment give all the suggested insulin, the blood sugar almost turns, I don't want to say immediately, but it's shockingly quick after that. It really does feel like cause and effect in a way that you don't expect. I've never seen that manually working with an insulin pump, but I've seen it so many times in Loop that I trust that that's what's about to happen.
And I think that's largely those earlier doses that I was talking about is been giving you partial doses along the way, and those are all adding up.
Yeah, and you're this close, but it's just not tipping. And then you just push a little harder, and then all of a sudden you just see it go.
So some of the things that I was adjusting when I was tuning my system and making it more effective is some of the safety limits. You talked there about the 40%.
Right.
So in the IRF1 system, there's some controls for, it will do 50% of the calculated insulin. It will do 50% now, and then in 5 minutes, it might do another 50% of the new prediction. But there's also a limit of, it's essentially borrowing basal from the future. It calculates this is how much basal we need, and then it'll say, all right, I can use the next 90 minutes of that, I can bring forward into this initial dose.
Yeah.
Or maybe the next 45 minutes, or maybe the next 120 minutes. So you can make it more aggressive and borrowing stuff from the future. And if you do that too much and your settings aren't right, then it can end up essentially overdosing you. You'll go low later.
Right, right.
So the safety limits are set relatively low initially because they don't want it overreacting. So it was watch the system and see that I can see that I'm going up and I can see what it's dosing, and I don't think it's doing enough. I look at the calculations. There's all these messages coming out in the logs. If you go and look at the right page in the software, it says, we've constrained this because of this. Mm. And it's, all right, I'll increase the safety limits a bit. So there were some tweaking there, not just of changing my ratios and so on, but also freeing up the system so it was going to make the right choices without just opening the floodgates and letting it overdose me.
Too much. So let me ask you this. There's a person like yourself who understands all this and donates the time to it to help themselves out. But generally speaking, how many people do you think are doing this? Even across the globe? Like, how many people with type 1 do you think are using some sort of a do-it-yourself algorithm? Can it be that many?
Tens of thousands at least.
Okay. I mean, that's one of those things where, like, that's a substantial number until you look at the whole of everybody who uses insulin to stay alive, and then you're like, well, nobody does it. Why do you think that is? Because, I mean, Arden's been looping for years now. You know, she took a break and did Omnipod 5 for a while, which worked exactly the way we expected it to, but she really did not want to carry around the receiver that was necessary for it. So right before she went back to college, she's like, can I please switch back to loop? And I was like, yeah, that's fine. She's like, I just like it on my phone. And it's interesting because she doesn't really have a lot of the concern about the switches and the levers. She was just like, this is fine or this is fine. And in her mind, it came down to carrying a thing. But I know how well it works, David. Like, any of them. Like, but why can't we get people onto them? Like, why is there not like a mass? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you have any idea?
Well, I think the commercial loop systems, the good thing about those is they become more accessible to more people easily because the doctors can just basically scribble on the books and say, right, we need to get you this and get you set up.
Yeah.
And they've got a better chance than not having access to it at all. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's changed here in Australia is halfway through this year, we finally got CGM subsidized for everyone with type 1.
Right. Yeah.
So instead of paying 330 Australian dollars for a month's worth of sensors, we now pay $32. Mm-hmm. And strangely enough, that's making it a lot more accessible for the companies to introduce their loop systems because now Medtronic is saying, well, if you that's what we have to do is with the subsidy is we have to specify which CGM system we're using. So Medtronic is saying, if you lock into the Medtronic CGM, we will give you a Medtronic 780G. We will upgrade you. Mm-hmm. Because they get to sell sensors and everyone gets the benefit along the way of, a closed loop system. Ipsomed here in Australia, they have the little Ipso pump, and that's they've now got CAM APS, which is another closed loop system that runs against that pump. That's now rolling out in Australia, and suddenly a lot more people are saying, I've got access to this stuff.
Great. Yeah.
I think the uptake of people who are using closed loop systems, I think it's going up dramatically, and we want to see some more statistics and polls on that to sort of see what's going on. I ran a poll a couple of years ago on the number of loopers in Australia. It was a couple hundred at the time, but that was all do-it-yourself stuff at that mm-hmm. point.
Yeah, I mean, here in America, where things are, I mean, a lot of these different devices are readily available, and a number of people have coverage that would allow them to get them. I don't know. I know that's not how things work, but if this was me, the minute this was available, I'd take the day off and just say to myself, well, I'm going to sit down and figure out how to make this happen right now. And I don't know. I don't know why there are just so many more people who will never pump even versus the ones who will. And there are, and all of the stuff in between.
I think of it as a sense of inertia. Like for me, my endo suggested quite a few times, this the pump might be good for you, and I know how this system works. I'm still alive; it's running fine. But my clinical results when I got access to a CGM and I started being able to look at the data myself and see what was going on, it was, this isn't good enough.
Right. Yeah. Well, back then, you're just alive as your Mendoza line. You're like, I'm not dead. This is working.
Well, I'm not dead. And I got an HbA1c from my doctor when I saw him. And it was a good one this time. So he said, come back in 12 months' time.
Yeah.
And, look, it was a bad one. He says, come back in 3 months. And it was, I didn't know what I was doing differently because I didn't have the tools to see what was going on.
Yeah. Even that was random, huh? So, so when you found yourself in that situation, if you were being given the golden ticket of you don't have to come back for a year, it doesn't mean that 6 weeks from now your A1C wasn't on its way up and you had no idea, really. Yeah,
I had no idea.
Right.
But I've got my path results back to 2000 or so, and I can see my HbA1c bounced around. It got up to 8.1. It was down at 7. It got down to a massively low 6 when I started on the pump, and then it gradually started creeping up again.
Mm-hmm.
But after I started looping in 2017, it went down to 5.8, went down to 5.6. It has never been as high as 5.6 since.
Yeah.
So it ranges between 5.0 and 5.4.
And you're active as well. You have, and you're paying attention, all that stuff.
Yeah. I mentioned before my time in range for 70 to 140 is around 85. So my time in range for 70 to 180, which is the more traditional clinical range, is about 95%.
Right. No, that's amazing.
And my time below 70 is about 2%.
Yeah. No, I have to say, we don't see it. I mean, lows just are very infrequent.
Yeah. So I feel very comfortable with where all my glycemia is. I know day to day it can go up and down and bounce around, but overall, I'm in a good place. I'm feeling quite good because I actually had a scare a few years ago with some atherosclerosis. So partial blockages around the heart. I didn't have a heart attack or anything, but a random stress echo said, that's abnormal. And we went down the investigation path, and I thought I was going to have stents and all sorts of stuff, but I managed to get out of it without that. And this was about the time that I was advancing a bunch of my glucose management.
Yeah.
And the cardiologist now looks at it and says, you're fine.
Great.
So I've got the general feeling that health-wise, I'm in as good a place as I can be.
Right.
So a lot of what I'm trying to do is make sure that keeps there, but also do what I can to make this stuff available to more people.
Well, back then, were you feeding insulin? Did you have a lot of, were you eating a lot to stop lows and things like that? Or the heart issue was about 2.5 years ago. But I think I'd already started fixing things, but we hadn't noticed anything. Maybe in ideal worlds, maybe it's already healing. Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Because we didn't find it because of a heart attack. We found it because I had a faint because of low blood pressure, which the cardiologist says, that was probably just that you were exercising more. And so we've reduced the blood pressure meds. Because I was on mild dose on that, and now I'm on half a mild dose.
Right.
So we sort of found it by accident. So maybe it was something that was happening earlier, and it's been getting better through this. But it's certainly notably been getting better because we've been looking a lot more closely at the heart stuff over the last few years, and everything just keeps staying stable and
that's
all
excellent.
fine.
Well, good for you. That really is wonderful. Do you have any what we would consider, I don't know, issues from diabetes?
You were trying to avoid the complications
I
word.
don't want to say complications, but do you have anything that you are dealing with?
Um, there's no.
No.
I saw my ophthalmologist a couple of weeks ago, and she said she's got a very nice Sri Lankan accent, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but she says there is no diabetes in your eyes. So,
Perfect.
oh, good. That's what I like to hear. There's no effect of diabetes, but it sounds funny the way she says it.
Right.
And it was come back in 18 months. And I'm in fact seeing her particularly because of a congenital thing we found in one of my optic nerves we found years ago, and we started treating that. We wouldn't have found it if I wasn't having my regular diabetes examinations.
Mm-hmm.
So diabetes in my eyes is not an issue,
Yeah.
but I feel that my eyes are healthier than they would have been without diabetes because we wouldn't have found this thing.
Yeah. So maybe saved you from a different issue.
Yeah. So the cardiologist says the heart stuff is not related to diabetes. It's just stuff that happens when you get older.
Mm-hmm.
Although he's only ever known me when I've had normal HbA1c, etc. levels. So I don't know if it was something in the past. Who knows? I've got, what was it? A hand physiologist said I've got the early signs of something that may turn into contracture of one of the tendons on my hand, but it's something that they can fix. It's not I think it's just an early sign.
Right.
So maybe that might develop, but that's about as close to a diabetes issue as I can imagine.
That sounds pretty terrific, honestly.
I'm very lucky.
Yeah. Is it in your family at all? Type 1?
No.
You don't
No. Well, I remember, stories about there was an aunt or something, a great aunt, whatever, who died of something. But back then, maybe in the 80s, going back in time, from what people knew about 10 years ago, if they'd gone back, they might have said she had type 2. But if they'd gone back now and done better tests, they might have said, oh, she actually had type 1. Who knows?
Right. How about other autoimmune stuff?
Like the celiac disease. Celiac disease is the only thing, and that came on after several decades.
Okay.
So that's the closest thing to a second autoimmune thing that I've got.
For you, how about in your family? Do you see any other thyroid stuff or digestion issues, anything at all with people?
No, not yet.
That's interesting. Do you have children of your own?
No.
Okay.
I have nieces and nephews. I can wind them up and hand them back. I don't have my own.
Listen, there are days that sounds right to me. So, interesting. Okay. Has it been, I mean, you said you've done wildlife photography and other things like that. I mean, it doesn't sound like diabetes has stopped you from doing things throughout your life.
No, not really. If I was looking at going on the Australian Antarctic Division runs supply trips every year down to the bases in Antarctica, and they have some humanities berths on there where basically artists can go along and record what's happening and so on. So there was an opportunity as a photographer to get onto that. So I thought, oh, this is exciting. I looked into that, and as soon as it was, oh no, you've got diabetes, you're not eligible.
Oh.
Because they make you go through all the same medical things as someone who was going to overwinter and stay there.
Right.
And, if you don't have enough insulin, you're going to die, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So it was basically, no, you're not eligible. So that was a little bit disappointing. But hey, guess what? I found another way. I've been to Antarctica 4 times now.
Really?
I run photography trips down there.
You make the rules, so you can allow people with diabetes to go.
So yeah, I've that's also tickled the travel bug. So I've been to lots of places around the world, whether it's jungles in Borneo or up in the Himalayas with snow leopards in the middle of winter. And so most places I go, I need to worry about keeping my insulin cool enough. There, I need to make sure it wasn't going to freeze overnight.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, I feel that I live my life and diabetes has to come along for the ride.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent.
one of the other things that you were asking before, what we should talk about, one of the other things that a lot of people might find interesting is something that I'm not responsible for, but a lot of people seem to associate my name with, and it's the Anubis G6 transmitters. So the Dexcom G6 transmitters, they run for 100 days and then they turn off.
Mm-hmm.
Familiar with this? And in the early days, people were able to cut them open, replace the batteries and seal them up again, and then they'd go for another 100 days. But Dexcom changed things so that you can't do that. So I know some people who've did some engineering, and they modify G6 transmitters now. And we went through a phase where we were trying to work out how to get this working. I managed to get a bunch of people in the US, including some of the people from the Facebook group. They donated old transmitters, and we sent them over here, and then basically pulling them apart and using them as test beds and trying to make things work. So what they have now is a system where an old Dexcom G6 gets recycled and it becomes an Anubis G6. And the Anubis comes with a battery that's sealed in the bottom with clear silicone. So when it's time to replace the battery, you can actually see, that's where I dig in and dig out the battery, and I stick this other new battery in and I seal it up again, and it automatically resets. These are really convenient because they have a bunch of other advantages. The transmitter doesn't time out after 100 days, times out after 180 days because they have a bigger than normal battery in them. It doesn't stop your sensor after 10 days, it stops your sensor after 60 days. So I can run my sensors for 20 days and not have to do any restarts along the way. That's really convenient.
And do you notice that it holds up as far as accuracy goes?
Oh, it's the G6. They didn't change any of that stuff.
Yeah, right. So I just meant having the wire in for that long.
With G5, my record was 53 days. What I'm doing now is I used to run sensors for as long as I could because we had to pay for them all ourselves, and it cost a lot of money. So you'd be saying, all right, is it unstable yet? Is it time to change it? No, it can go another day. And then suddenly it goes out the window and right now I've got this outage I need to start up. So I set up something where I could, if I've got two transmitters, I put in a new sensor with new transmitter, and I've essentially got another program talking to it, and I start the session on that transmitter. And then when it's warmed up and it's ready, hopefully before the old one has completely died, I tell my loop system, use that transmitter instead of that transmitter, and it gets good data. So I don't have 2-hour warm-up as long as I've done everything right, because it's already warmed up and had the first day of weirdness out of the way before I switch over.
Wow.
So now that we've got things subsidized, and they subsidize them for essentially one every 10 days, I'm actually putting a new one in every 12 days. And then I'll switch over to the new one after another day or so. So once I know it's stable, and it's really nice being able to see two lines and say, no, that old sensor is going weird, or the new sensor is going weird. Suddenly it's not just finger pricks and CGM. We've got finger pricks and 2 CGMs that we can compare.
Right.
And it means that the amount of time my system is actually making decisions and looping is pretty much 100% all the time, because the CGM never actually has to disconnect and warm up.
Right. Do you think the G7 will cause problems for the DIY community, or do you think people will be able to?
Not especially. The G7 is essentially doing some of the same stuff because each sensor has its own transmitter.
Mm-hmm.
That's where this new stuff comes on, where after 10 days it says start the new one, but I'll keep using the old one for 12 hours.
Yeah.
So it's essentially doing the same thing, but it automatically switches over.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it'll be harder for people to try and extend the system in the way that we've managed to do it with the Anuba stuff. Now, the reason people associate me with some of the Anuba stuff is on my blog. I posted an article saying there's this amazing thing. It works really well because I've been testing it for them. And I get people sending me messages saying, "Oh, can you sell me one?" It's not mine. I'm not involved.
I'm just using it.
I just talked about it. But the guys who distribute those, by the way, they're not selling them for profit. They're pretty much essentially giving them away. They get donated old transmitters that are getting recycled, and they've set up little machine shops that have laser engravers and cut everything out, and it's all automated.
Wow.
Just home workshop stuff from people who have diabetes for the benefit of other people with diabetes.
People, that can't afford to do it.
It's hard to imagine how any of that could be applied to a G6 where everything's integrated and then applied, and then you take it off and then it's done.
G7.
Not as though sorry, the G7.
Yeah.
So I am thankful that we have subsidy here. So if I have to use them one every 10 days, I'll be able to afford it.
Mm-hmm. No, it's amazing. I've talked to people just, in the last 2 years in Australia who are like, I can't afford anything, to those same people sending me notes and saying, hey, look, I have a CGM now, or I have a pump now. Or like, it's amazing how quickly things are kind of moving there. Yeah. It's excellent.
Yeah. So I expect people will be able to use G7 in the, with the open source software, the do-it-yourself stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's already happening in Europe. People have been working out how to talk to them.
Yeah. Well, it's been out for just a handful of weeks now, right, in Europe. And, my expectation is it's going to be the next couple of months. It'll be in the U.S., so you're going to start seeing it everywhere pretty soon. As long as the FDA, I don't know what the hell their holdup is, but as soon as that goes away, I guess we're going to see it here.
Yes. Now in Australia, because most people are getting it through subsidy, I think introducing it here, it's not as though it'll get introduced and sold in cash sales and then eventually added to the subsidy. I think they'll be lining everything up so that when it comes here, it'll be with the subsidy. So I don't know how long that's going to take.
Yeah.
But we've only had G6 here for about 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've had G6 for longer over there.
Yeah. I know I hear Canadians often talk about feels like a chasm of time between when new stuff comes out and they actually get it. I guess it's similar. I don't know. I wish I understood more why that happens, but I just don't. You would think that people with diabetes everywhere, right? And there's governments you can charge for the stuff. Like, let's get going.
Yeah. Life is multifactorial. So there's a limited market in Australia compared to the US.
Mm-hmm.
So all their costs for going through and setting up things with the regulators and importing and doing all those things, there's more overhead. Yeah. So are they going to make enough sales for it to happen? Now that things are subsidized, if they can get onto the subsidized list, it's easier for them to say, all right, we're going to have a steady supply.
Right.
So hopefully that will enable things
to move quicker.
But yeah, dealing with different regulators in different places does add a lot of time.
Yeah, it really does. And in the meantime, there's people who, you would think that if you were the government, why would you not say, all right, well, maybe we don't have as many people here with type 1, but let's make it attractive for these companies to come in and service at least the people that we do have. That part is a little interesting,
Well, the other thing is Legumejev. Legumejev has been available overseas for ages,
mm-hmm.
and we're over here saying it's really great. We've imported some and used it, and it's great. Why can't we actually get it properly? And we're saying the same thing. We had years before Fiat was approved here, and then still years before it actually became available. But when it becomes available here, again, the drugs are subsidized through the Pharmacy Benefits Scheme, PBS.
Mm-hmm.
But the price that the manufacturer gets is controlled by the government. Basically, the Australian government doesn't pay a lot for the drugs.
Right.
So that will play into, are we going to make enough sales at that price to make it worthwhile to bring it in.
Yeah.
Novo got Tresiba approved in Australia a few years back. They don't actually import it to sell it because they're not going to move enough of it. They sell Rysodeg, the mixed one, but not plain Tresiba.
It's interesting.
Just as an example, someone said, no, it's not going to be worthwhile. And there's all sorts of weird things because there's the way the drug subsidy stuff was set up. You can't introduce a newer form, a different form of the same drug. You can't have too many forms of them. There's all sorts of controls without having to basically get less money for the drugs. Mm-hmm. There's all this competitive stuff built in. But that actually meant a few years ago that when FIASP was introduced here, it was available in, because FIASP is actually insulin aspart. So it's not actually a separate drug. It's the same as NovaRapid, which was already in the list, which was available in pre-filled pens, in pen cartridges, and in vials.
Okay.
And then faster acting insulin aspart is available in pens and vials, but they didn't introduce pen cartridges because that would be too many, and then they wouldn't get as much money from the government for the drug. So it's complicated.
It's dizzying. Yeah, it really is. I'm just, people need stuff. It'd be nice to find a way to get it to them in a way that is affordable and reasonable and easy. It's already tough to have diabetes. You start jumping through hoops to get things accomplished, and you can see easily why it doesn't have. I mean, to take it out of diabetes for a second, my mom just moved with my brother, and she had to live with him for a little while she established residency in a new state before she could go to this place that she wanted to go to and get the assistance that she needed and she wanted and everything. And the amount of phone calls and paperwork, if my brother and his wife were not doing this work for him, my 80-year-old mother could not accomplish any of this. Like, there's a system set up for people that they functionally can't take part in. And, you have to have somebody helping you. What if you don't? What if you don't have someone helping you? Like, then what happens? You know what I mean? Like, it's fascinating.
That actually opens up another concern with the fancy technology we use these days. What happens when we get older?
Yeah, I think.
And we go into aged care. So we have quite a few loopers in Australia who are in their 70s, and I think some are in their 80s now, and it's something that people talk about. What's going to happen later on at some point in my life? And I guess it could happen to all of us. What happens if I'm involved in an accident? I have a friend from university who has an acquired brain injury and later develops diabetes and isn't able to deal with any of this stuff. Right. Everything has to be through a carer. And what's going to happen when the family carer gets old? Mm-hmm. So that feeds back into, we need to make this technology as accessible to people as possible so that not just can people without the background and experience that, say, I have, can use it, but also that someone looking after them who isn't especially skilled can look after them.
No, I think about that. You have diabetes. I'm sure you think about it for yourself, but as somebody who's looking at a child with it, I think about that constantly because my daughter is going to be older and in need of help at a time where I won't exist anymore. That's hard to deal with, like, is she going to meet a person who will help her, or, will she have enough money to be in a healthcare system that can help her? Also, I've seen my mom in that healthcare system, and due respect, they're not great with giving you a pill when they're supposed to sometimes, or, managing things that are not nearly as complicated as diabetes. So I don't know. It's a frightening idea.
It still comes up every now and then, but we're still, we are hopefully moving away from the world where someone would go into hospital and they have diabetes for some unrelated thing, and the doctors would take and the nurses would take their insulin away, and then it's oh, you need to have your evening insulin now, but you haven't given me the food yet. The food's not here. No, no, we need to chart this now, or you have your food now. We'll come around later with the insulin. All of this stuff is tightly integrated into our lives. That like, I have a colonoscopy coming up in a little while, and I'm thinking ahead to when it comes to what day is it on? When am I going to be starting my CGM sensor? Where is my pump site going to be? Because I'm going to be lying on the bed this way, and they're going to need to put a cuff there and put a line in here. And it's no good if I have technology in the way. So all this stuff is tightly integrated into how we live our lives.
Yeah. And anyway, all right, now you're bumming me out, David.
I'm actually participating in a summit in a couple of weeks. One of the big research bodies here is having a series of panel discussions. And one of the things we're talking about is how this stuff integrates. And the reason that's in my mind is that sort of some of the things we talked about before, some of the design decisions behind this technology are often made by people who don't actually live with it and don't actually realize that, oh, it affects this. Oh, that means you're going to put this site there. So for me, an Omnipod, I use Omnipod DASH every now and then. Not regularly, but I've got a couple of boxes, and if I'm going for water sports or something, I might change to a pod and a waterproof looping phone for that weekend. But I need to be very careful about where I put the pod, because it's very particular about the radio reception. If someone's dealing with the PDM, which is the insulet way of doing things, you pick up your PDM and you bolus or you change a basal or something, and then you put the PDM away. Whereas me, I've got the looping phone that's talking to it, and it needs to talk to it every 5 minutes. And if the pod is on my right-hand side and the phone is on my left-hand side, and I'm a big bag of water right in the middle blocking the radio signals, things don't always work neatly. And people are finding that with the Omnipod 5, that you need to make it's better if the CGM
has good line of sight
to the pod. It's the same sort of thing. I have to think about where my phone is, where the CGM is, and where the pump is.
Yeah.
So flexibility for me, when I'm using a tubed pump, I can have my pump in pretty much the same spot every time, and the tubing just goes to wherever the site is. In some ways, a tubed pump is better for me than a pod.
Because you have that option. Yeah, so you always know where the pump is going to be, and then you just move the site.
Yeah, I mean, there have been times when it's, for these couple of weeks, it's on my right side, so I need to make sure I put the looping phone in a pocket on my right or a pocket on my left, whereas these days it's just, no, it's the same every time. My pump lives in a little running belt, a speed belt.
Yep.
That's underneath my clothes around my waist, so it's always in the same spot, and then the tubing runs along the belt and then up or down to wherever the site is.
If you tried to make this argument to Arden, she'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not attaching anything to me, so I can't get up. It's just so interesting where everybody's perspective comes from their entry point, really. You have a different perspective.
This thing of tubed versus untubed, I started off with an NMS pump. I had a talisman around my neck, and an SOS, whatever, talisman's medical alert thing. So if I was it was in the middle of the night, I was going to the toilet or something, and I had to put my pump somewhere, I would probably clip it to that around my neck, and then the tubing runs down to where the site is. But I always had this extra thing I was carrying around and having to put somewhere or back into a pocket or something.
Yeah.
So yes, there was something attached to me. But when I started using the looping systems, I no longer had to touch the pump. The pump would hide away in a pocket. And my relationship with it changed.
Yeah.
Because now the pump is in that little running belt around my waist, and including when I go to bed. So if I wake up in the middle of the night and I have to go to the bathroom, I just get up and I walk down to the bathroom. The pump comes with me. I don't have to there's no feeling of, oh, I've got something attached to me, there's tubing somewhere. It just comes with me.
Yeah. Yeah, I know some
Whereas,
people who put it like on their bedside table, or it lives they leave it loose in the bed with them. I've heard people describe what you just described. It's interesting how it all works differently for everybody.
if you find a system that works for you, and I've used different systems along the way, and they've all, whatever I've been using at the time has mostly worked for me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, when the pods were introduced here a year and a half or so ago, there were some people. So the companies find people with diabetes who become advocates, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this wonderful system. It's changed my life, which is great and it's fine. But many times, some of those people, this is their first pump. So a lot of the things they describe about, oh, I can change this, I can change that, is yeah, you can do that on any pump. And they say, but there are no tubes. I don't have something dangling attached to me. And I say, oh, do I have some? I don't feel like I have anything dangling attached to me anymore. So in fact, when I use a pod, I'm restricted in terms of I need to fill it with the right amount of insulin, because there's this decision when I get to the end, have I put enough in it to last the 72 to 80 hours? If I've put more in it, am I going to pull some of that out and put it into something else? Because my insulin doesn't cost as much here, you can sort of say, well, I'll just use a new pod and fill it with new insulin. When I was using the Lumjet that I imported myself, I was a little bit more sensitive because every drop was money. And there are issues. If I have a problem with my sight, then I have to put a new pod on. Mm-hmm. Tonight, I put a new cannula in for my pump, and I put it in, and it was, that's not working. I can feel that's completely uncomfortable. I took it off, and the drop of blood comes out, and no, that's a bad sight. I'll just put it in somewhere else. And suddenly I've wasted 50 cents or $1 or something on a cannula. Mm-hmm. I haven't wasted a whole pod and then have to ring up and say, all this hassle about.
So David, here's the other side of it. If you're in America, you get your doctor to write you for more pods than you need, and then you draw out the insulin if it's new and pop it in the other one and keep moving. Like it's all the same. Like
I know. Yeah. But and there are ways around this. We each live within the constraints of the system that we're using.
Yeah.
But each time we use a pod and I get to the end of it and it's right, I'm going back to my other pump, that feels like old faithful, comfortable territory, going back to my tubed pod. So sure. the pod, to me at the moment, feels more restrictive. It's less restrictive. I can go swimming. Everything keep running. But in terms of general wear, it doesn't feel the same because I'm not used to it.
Well, you've just described exactly why all these device manufacturers are so focused on getting people when they're newly diagnosed as customers, because then this becomes your norm, and it's hard to imagine otherwise. It doesn't make the other option untenable. It just makes it different than what you're accustomed to. So, and you are right. Like, no matter what scenario you get put in, you do find a way to make it work as seamlessly as possible with your life. Doesn't matter if it's a pump or a CGM or whatever it is, you fit it in and you make it work. And then suddenly it feels like this is the option, the only option. Well, makes sense.
Yeah. And different systems have different advantages. And sure. I think a lot of people, as you say, they get locked into the system that they're using and they don't necessarily realize that the grass might be greener on the other side of that fence, or maybe on the other side of the highway, maybe just in the next paddock, whatever. So when I started on an NMS pump, I was using the infusion sets that my diabetes educator had suggested.
Right.
And I was using them for years. Those were the ones that I used. Oh, if there's a supply issue and I can't get those, what am I going to do? I'll manage to get some. Oh, I've got out of it. It's okay. And some of my friends who are interstate, they were using some different ones and they were having supply issues and all sorts of dramas. And I realized that, well, maybe I should try one of these other ones. maybe if I wasn't tied to this one, I'd have some flexibility if there was a shortage.
Yeah.
Now, it's convenient here that all of our infusion sets are subsidized to the same level. Once you're registered as a pump user, you can get any of those at subsidized price.
I see.
So I can, in fact, switch to a different pump type if I have the pump. I can buy the other supplies. I don't need a prescription for each one. But that meant that, let's try the steel cannula. Let's try the angle cannula. I'll get a box of those and see how they go. So I've now used pretty much everything, and I've found the ones that I like. And I've got to the stage that, I get old secondhand pumps of different types. I've now used pretty much every type of pump on the market.
Yeah.
And most CGM. So my decisions about which ones I'm going to keep using is, I've used some of the others. They don't necessarily feel right, but sometimes there's something that, that's nicer. Because, for example, I started using the comfort sites, which Tandem now call them the very soft. Medtronic call them the silhouette, the angled one. And they turned out to be, they were great. They were nice and comfortable. It's manual insertion, which was quite daunting, but once you got that over and done with, it was fine. And it actually turned out that I can pack a lot more of them in a camera bag when I'm going to Africa.
So that makes them good. Yeah.
All sorts of other advantages.
It's so interesting to hear people talk about these little things. I remember when Arden was really young and we were looking for pumps, and we were drawn to the idea of the Omnipod. A nurse practitioner who tried everything they could to scare us away from, like, don't use that. Everything they could think of, like, your daughter's too lean, it won't work. You're not going to like the angle that the cannula goes in on. If you don't like the angle the cannula goes in on, you can't go to a different set, and blah, blah. And I just was like, wow, like, I look back on that now and I realize she was just coming from the perspective that she had, which was, this back then, this insulin pump was brand new. She didn't have any experience with it. These were her experiences before. She didn't really know if what she was saying was going to apply to us. She was just like, here's all the things you should be scared about. And, I'm like, okay, thanks. We tried it anyway. And then those things didn't end up being an issue. And it's a long story, but in 20 seconds, like 2 years after Arden started an insulin pump, our practice apologized to us. They came to us and said, we're sorry for how we tried to scare you away from using this pump. Like, your daughter's having so much success with it. We're going to start talking to other kids her age about it. And I thought, like, that's just always stuck with me. Like, they were so adamant. They had rules and lists and reasons. And they were like, this is why you can't buy this thing. And then later they're like, we were wrong about that. Sorry. I was like, Jesus. Okay. What else are you wrong about? Is how it made me feel.
Well, yeah. Like in my own head, I have lots of experience with, I've used lots of different equipment, different CGMs, different glucose meters, pumps, all sorts of stuff. I'm not necessarily an expert in all of them, but I've noticed some of the differences, and I sometimes point those out to people because they haven't necessarily noticed those. They don't know those things going in. So try to give people as much information as possible. But I guess there's the trap there. I shouldn't necessarily be trying. I shouldn't be trying to frighten someone away from using something because I find something an issue. I can point out to them that this thing exists and it might be an issue for them. But trying to find that middle ground of trying to scare someone or trying to inform someone is always tricky.
It's all communication. Had that person done what you just explained, it would have been completely different. It would have said, look, here's some things that could possibly happen. Here's why this may or may not be important to you. This pump over here won't do that. This one will. Like, I would have been like, okay, that would have been information to take in. But instead, it felt like I don't know. It felt like a scared person or an anti-sales pitch. Like, you started looking around like, do they work for somebody? Like, they were so just, pushy. But I don't think, looking back, wasn't their intention. I just think they had a certain set of I was going to say priorities, but I think it's perspective. I think they had experiences and perspective, and they were unknowingly defending that perspective against what they saw as being different. It's fascinating. In my heart, I think people should use what works best for them. Like I take ads on the podcast, but I have to be honest, like I don't care if you buy an Omnipod or not. Like I want you to have an insulin pump that works for you. And if Omnipod's the one, great. You know what I mean? Like I don't know, like sometimes I think that can get blended a little bit. Like, well, he has ads for Dexcom. Like, get a Libre. I mean, what do I give it?
Well, presumably you might not be so comfortable running ads for a company if you had concerns about the product.
Of course. No, there have been plenty that I've turned down over the years. And there are some that have been easier to take because I have that personal experience with them. Like I can, like when Dexcom comes to me and says, hey, can we buy an ad on your podcast? I immediately think, what are the reasons why when anyone comes to me and asks for an ad, my first thought is I want to know all the reasons why I shouldn't do this, because if they're too great, or it's bad for the people listening, I won't do that. And that may sound like I'm protecting you all, which I am to some degree, but I'm also protecting myself, because if I say, hey, use this pen and you all run out and buy this pen and it sucks, well, then you're going to stop listening to the podcast. You're going to be like, oh, the guy was wrong about the pen. I wonder what else he's wrong about. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a bit of self-preservation in there as well for me. And I have comfort with the things that I advertise for. I mean, like Gvoke HypoPen is a great example. That thing came out and I was like, well, that's brilliant. Like yes, finally a form factor I can put in my daughter's hand. Her friends can understand it and etc. You ever try to explain the Lily Red kit to a 9-year-old?
Well,
Yeah,
we the only glucagon we have here is the Novo Hypo kit, which is essentially the same thing as the Red Lily kit.
Mm-hmm. They're going to keep making it because Lily's stopping.
Yeah, well, that's Novo's product, at the glucagon product at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's no signs that they're stopping. Good. We don't have access to Baqsimi or Gvoke or any of those.
Yeah. No, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was reminded from what you were saying, some of the stuff that comes up on my blog and what we were saying about advising other people. There's always, when I started writing things and putting it down on the blog, I was always conscious that this stuff's going to be up there. Anyone can read it.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be saying the wrong thing. But there's also this big thing with the open source, the do-it-yourself equipment of, this is not medically approved. If I tell someone, I can't tell someone you should build this system and it will work for you. I can't do that legally. I would get myself in a lot of trouble. But luckily what I can do and stay on the right side of the law is say, this is what I'm doing and it's working for me.
Mm-hmm.
These are the things that I've noticed about it, example. So I always try to keep that in mind and try to not cross the line of giving something that could be misconstrued as medical advice. Yeah. I always have it in the context of my experience. So I write about a lot of technology, but it's mostly in terms of, I have actually used this. This is my opinion of it. These are the things that I've noticed.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's been working very well. It's quite pleasing when I'm at a diabetes conference as one of the community advocates there, and I get stopped in the hallway by endocrinologists who say, thank you for the blog. I was able to direct some of my patients to it.
Yeah.
And that's great.
I completely understand what you're talking about. And I'm never not knocked over when somebody comes into the Facebook group and they answer those quick questions about, what's your attachment to diabetes, blah, blah. How did you hear about this? When people say, oh, my doctor sent me here, I'm always like, wow, that's great. Like, just terrific. And I take all your points too. Like, I'm just sharing what's worked for my daughter, basically, and things that I've noticed along the way. And, but the feeling of, I guess the way I handled it is I might do a good job of sometimes sounding like I'm like, oh, I just thought of this, which has happened a time or two where something's like popped into my head as we were talking. But for the most part, I don't say stuff on here until I've seen it work over and over and over again for my daughter. That would be irresponsible. I don't understand. Yeah, I couldn't do that either. So it's a great thing you're doing. It really is.
It does feel sometimes when I'm moderating some of the Facebook groups, and it does feel sometimes that I'm being very wishy-washy with my answers, saying, well, you could do this, but you should see a doctor.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I try to just say, if this was me or the way I see this, it could be wrong for you. I'm only looking at one graph. There's no way for me to really know. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff. But you should be looking in this direction.
I guess I've just realized, I guess I had a lot of experience in that before the diabetes advocacy, because I've been involved in amateur photography stuff for a long time, the Australian Photographic Society, and various photo competitions and giving critique on photos. And you learn very early on to give constructive critique and not criticism per se. And you can always find something constructive to say about pictures. So when I'm giving feedback on photos, and it's something that I still do to some of the camera clubs, I'm very careful to try and give suggestions and things that they may not have thought about without saying this is good, this is bad.
Yeah.
Because I'm setting myself up for being attacked at that point.
I tend to lean into the what is it called? Is it the Socrates questioning method, or like the idea of teaching by asking questions? You know, like oftentimes it's a version of you can, teach a man to fish kind of a thing. And,
I have got into trouble with that with my family at times when they say, don't ask me another question, just answer the question.
Well, online, I find it's great to say, hey, well, do you think this or this just happened? And then you kind of sometimes people know, they just don't know how to put the pieces together. Yeah. And, I find that a pretty valuable way to talk to everybody. But David, I have to jump off in a minute, but this was terrific. I just want to make sure that we covered everything, that you don't have anything left hanging that you didn't get out.
I don't think so at this point. I think I've covered a broad selection. There'll be something new and different that's happening next month or whatever, but that's next month. I guess this will take a while for this to come out anyway. It'll still hopefully be fairly up to date when it does.
Yeah, well, because we're talking about things that are more time sensitive with technology, I will slide it up on the schedule so it doesn't sound like it came out of left field. But yeah, things change quickly, right? Like Arden is off at school right now using Eros pods and the version of the loop that she's using now, and she might come home and over like the holiday break, and we might switch her to something different and send her back with something different. I have no idea.
You just reminded me about something that went through my head earlier when she was saying, I don't want to carry this PDM. I want the system running off my phone. But she's still happy to carry around an Orange Link or Riley Link or whatever.
So that
as the gateway.
What? So she's not happy about it. It was a trust me, she hates that too. But I got her to be okay with that by telling her that eventually there'll be a system that doesn't require that. And it's smaller, and she keeps it in her diabetes bag, and the Orange Link seems to have a much better a field of coverage than the Riley Link did. So she's the Riley Link was like you had to bring the bag with you everywhere you went. But now if she's in her dorm room or she's in our house, she can walk away from the Orange Link and still has a good connection to it. So that's become less of an issue over time. And then I assume we're going to go to the Dash version and lose that issue altogether.
So. Well, we never had the Eros here in Australia. So they finally, it got approved, but never sold here. And then eventually they tried to sell, but they decided to do it with the Dash. So they switched over. So the reason that came to mind is I've been an iPhone user for well over a decade. Mm-hmm. But I don't use the iPhone for my diabetes. I use an Android phone. So I'm carrying two phones, but my Android phone is like
teeny tiny. Yeah.
Almost the size of my palm.
Right.
And it just has enough battery to run all day, and it's doing all the stuff that's sitting in the background. And it displays out to a watch, so I can just see my CGM data at any point if I need it.
Yeah.
But I'm happy carrying that second device. Whereas some people come to these systems and say, I'm an iPhone user. I I wouldn't touch Android. That's the dark side.
I don't care about that. You're basically using a controller as well. It just didn't come from a company, honestly, right? By using an Android phone.
And in fact, it stays away hidden in a pocket most of the times. I am a guy. I sometimes wear cargo pants. I have a lot more pocket options than many girls. I do understand this.
Yeah. Arden just doesn't want to, I don't know, you should see, like, the idea of holding two devices. If I offered her two phones, she'd be like, no, I don't. I mean, I don't know why you would, but I mean, she wouldn't want to do that either. Like, she's trying to be very minimalistic with what she's carrying. So she's doing a good job. Her bag for diabetes is tiny. It's got a phone in it, that Orange Link, Gvoke, a meter, the Contour X1 meter, test strips, and, some gummy bears and a juice box. And she gets it all into this little tiny thing. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, she's doing good.
And the other thing that came to mind was sort of paraphrasing one of the other things we were talking about in terms of people look at the stuff that's working for me with my hands-free loop system. It's not loop with a capital L, hands-free looping system, and say, well, you don't have to do any work. But then I can point it out to them, and various friends of mine who are there in conversations turn around and say, yeah, but he put in a lot of learning to get there. He did a lot of work early on to work out how to control it, and now he can take the benefit of hands-free. So part of the thing that we're hoping to get out of things like this trial and other stuff is more knowledge about how to actually turn it on for people without them having to put in all that homework.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's going to be the next big step, right? Is not having to understand the background to make it do all these amazing things. So I don't know. Like, I've seen some people try to turn that into a business. I don't know how well that'll work out as time moves forward or not, but it seems it's a weird thing to be involved in, setting up a do-it-yourself algorithm to give somebody else insulin. Like, I don't know. It sounds like you're gonna have to sign a couple of things that say you're not holding anybody responsible in the beginning to get to that.
Well, I'm dealing with algorithms to give myself insulin. So if I make modifications to the code, which I occasionally do, I'm running them. I've got a bank of test phones and test pumps here that are running on a copy of my CGM feed to make sure they're doing the right thing. And eventually I'll decide, yes, I'm willing to run that myself. I don't have to go through ethics approval and all sorts of stuff to do that. So when it comes time to running the algorithms through the clinical trials, that will give the evidence for, hopefully at some point a commercial company will say, well, we will take that and we'll make a product out of that using that algorithm which has been proven. So
I hope that all the time.
I don't care if someone makes money out of selling that.
Yeah.
Hope it would be nice if I can earn a living along the way somewhere as as well as anything else I need to do. But the end goal is improving everyone's lives.
Yeah, I always think that. Like when oh God, what's his name came along and said we're going to bring a version of Loop to market. God, why?
Howard at
Tidepool. I mean, I'm starting to feel like that's so long ago I can't remember the word Tidepool is and I understand the process. You know what I mean? Like, I understand the process is what it is, but I mean, by the time you get that thing through, there's so many more versions of it. You think, well, you should have started with that one. You know what I mean? And I guess that's also, if you make that decision, you'll never get to the end. But it is what's exciting about people doing it in a do-it-yourself atmosphere is that, I mean, something comes out and they go, okay, we'll adapt it, we'll test it, we'll get a few people together, we'll make a beta test out of it. We feel comfortable giving it out to people here, give it a shot. Like, that stuff isn't taking 3 years when it's being done by regular people. So
no, so generally the do-it-yourself stuff is always going to be a little bit ahead in terms of features and functions.
Sure.
Hopefully people do it in a safe way.
Yeah.
Many of us are keeping all the safety in mind when we're designing this stuff. I've seen in some of the meetings, I've heard an endo stand up and ask the question, now that there are all these commercial systems available, why would you use a do-it-yourself system that you have to build yourself? And it's, because it's current technology. It's not technology from 3 years ago. It's got more features. Not everyone will want to do this, but that's why I do it.
Yeah. There's no reason why we should take any kind of options away from people. Like, I don't care if it gets down to
I guess
people,
his thought is, why do I need to deal with this problematic DIY stuff now that there's a commercial thing? So
I can see feeling that way. I can also see, like, I'm not going to lie to you, still, like, going into I'm so bad at this, I don't even know the program on the Mac that runs the simulator and then puts it on your phone is called Xcode, right? And so, and every time I look at Xcode, I don't know what I'm looking at. I know where I have to click and I know what I have to do. But if you asked me to explain any of that to somebody, I'd be like, I don't know what any of this is. And I get not wanting to feel like that because it's uncomfortable. You know, I sent my daughter got got a laptop when she started school and then got another one when she started college. And the one that she was done with after high school was shot. It's basically useless. And she's like, well, what do we do with this? And most of the time we would trade it in for credit or something like that and try to, make a little money off it. I was like, keep it. We'll put Xcode on it and you can take it to school with you, because Xcode wouldn't even fit on the laptop that she had along with all the other things she needed for school. Yep. I get not wanting to be involved in all that. But being able to text her last night and say, hey, it looks like you needed a secondary bolus, or, being able to look at a meal remotely and say, hey, the algorithm is struggling because I don't think it has enough autonomy. You should go back to the meal from 2 hours ago and tell it was 75 carbs, not 65 carbs. Like that. And then all of a sudden the algorithm's like, ooh, I didn't know that. And then bang, it works. And like that kind of stuff is pretty great. I can't lie about that. That stuff it's pretty damn great. So anyway, David, this was really wonderful. I appreciate you doing this with me. I'm sorry I kept you so long, but thank you very much.
No, it's fine. Oh, it's only 2 a.m.
Well, that's why you don't know. At this point, you're just like, it's all good. But I need to get you to bed.
I'm a night owl. So okay. It's fine. So thank you for the chat.
No, I appreciate it.
For people on the podcast too.
No, I'm sure people are going to love it. I really do appreciate you taking the time. And I know it's hard to get on the show and it takes forever. So thank you for being patient.
And people can message me on the Facebook group. I'm there.
Yeah, and I wanted to say too, you're bionicwookie.com. Is that right? It's .com?
That is correct.
Yeah, excellent. So people can see some of the stuff you were talking about there. It's a great website. Well, I want to thank David for coming on the show and sharing all that great diabetes knowledge with us. Some really astonishing stuff in this one. Thanks also to Touched by Type 1. Don't forget to go to touchedbytype1.org and find them on Facebook and Instagram. Give them a follow. Check out what they're doing. Long time supporter of me and the podcast. I hope you can support them. If you're enjoying the show, tell someone else about it. Share this episode with them. Go find the private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. And of course, subscribe in an app. Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your audio. You know what I mean? Subscribe and follow. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back again very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast.